All right, so we're going to lump two technologies together in this particular pre-lecture. So we're going to talk about stabilization ponds and aerated lagoons. So two different technologies that function very, very similarly. So ponds and lagoons are normally what we call a polishing step in wastewater treatment. So it's normally one of those steps where we've treated things to a specific level using primary and secondary treatment, and now we're just making sure that everything is ready to go before that wastewater hits a receiving body of water. It combines two different processes. So it combines the settling of any remaining solids that are in the system from any previous treatment steps, and it uses the same anaerobic or aerobic digestion principles that we've talked about for other treatment in order to try and remove any remaining organics from the system. So two different things that it does. So here's the difference between the two. Stabilization ponds are ponds that are quiescent, so they're not moving. Where water enters in an inlet, it's allowed to cycle in the system and then exits in an outlet. Exactly like it sounds, it is a pond. It mimics what happens naturally in ponds and lakes. Aerated lagoons are ponds that have added artificial aeration. Normally we have a floating pump that sits on the top of the surface of the aerated pond or lagoon, and it's normally paired with stabilization ponds. So the aeration is specifically to have more of that aerobic treatment, so this can be used as a secondary treatment option, and then normally we have some kind of a sedimentation basin or stabilization pond after an aerated lagoon to have multiple steps. Excuse me, so that's the difference between the two. Your pond is, both of them are actually very static. So we're not trying to have lots of turbulent flow in the system. We're just kind of letting things happen naturally like they would in the environment. So the idea is just like a lot of our aerobic digesters that we've talked about, we're using microbes to biooxidize organics using either aerobic or anaerobic respiration. It's normally a combination of the two. We normally don't have an anaerobic stabilization pond, we just have a stabilization pond. So it's always a combination of many different processes. And one thing that's a little bit different in ponds and lagoons is that we also use algae. And we let algae grow in many of these systems, and they aid the removal of CO2, nitrogenous compounds, so things like ammonia and nitrates, phosphates, and other radicals. So algae are autotrophic, and they use sunlight for their source of energy, much like plants do, to perform photosynthesis, and it's going to also help us nitrify nitrogenous compounds. So we have the benefit in ponds and lagoons of potentially getting nutrient removal from systems. So not only are we using bacteria like we use in our biogas digesters, but we're also using algae as a way to potentially remove other contaminants. So the idea is that it functions essentially just like an activated sludge process without that recycle component that we've seen where we bring in that activated compound over and over again. We're just doing this once. It's like a batch reactor. So this is an example of what a stabilization pond could look like. So this is the cross section. If you were to go down into the ground and look at it from the side, normally we have different zones. So a typical stabilization pond structure would have three different zones. We have one that's the anaerobic, we have one that's the facultative, and we have one that's aerobic. So the first one is for the organisms that don't need oxygen and they just produce sludge. And then the clean water that comes out of that goes into what we call a facultative lagoon. So in a facultative lagoon or a pond, you're using both anaerobic and aerobic. So these are organisms that can switch between doing aerobic or anaerobic digestion. And so we're getting more of that anaerobic digestion, but we're also starting to get aerobic. And then what leaves out of that out of that facultative lagoon and goes into the last step is aerobic maturation. So in this case, we're using oxygen to specifically have oxidation of chemicals. So normally it's not just one pond, it's a series of ponds. And they get progressively shallower and they move from aerobic to anaerobic treatment. I'm sorry, let me say that again. They move from anaerobic to aerobic. We start without oxygen and then we add oxygen. And then these photos here on this slide are showing you an aerated lagoon. So many times we have multiple cells and the water is just moving kind of naturally from an inlet to an outlet. We normally have what we call floating pumps on the top. So you can see that in that bottom, let me grab my laser pointer, in that bottom right corner. So these are pumps that are pumping water into the system, and you can kind of see that frothing of air on the surface in this bottom picture and in this top picture as well. So very similar technology, but we're now trying to add aeration. That adds a little bit of mixing to the system, which is sometimes something that we need, but it also adds oxygen to the system as well. So these tend to be a little bit more aerobic in nature and can be used as a secondary treatment process. So this is going to show you kind of a generalized flow diagram for what a pond looks like. So this is specifically stabilization ponds. So they can have many different designs. They can be circular, they can be rectangular, and typically we have what we call an intermittent sand filter at the end. So we will have two filters in parallel, and we'll use one at a time. So intermittent just basically means is that the water's not running through it all the time. It's running through it in batches. So the design of that's a little bit different because it's not continuous flow. But generally that filter from a sand filter is just meant to capture any last minute particles or things that we don't want going out into the receiving water, because typically a stabilization pond is right before we hit a receiving body of water and have our effluent. So you can see we have different designs, circular or rectangular, and at the bottom what you can see is you can see that cross section. So we build it such that the pond, we're pulling that effluent out and bringing it into the filter. This slide is going to show you what an aerated lagoon looks like. So again, you can see the aerators are placed kind of regularly throughout this basin. And generally we have a final clarifier after an aerated lagoon. So that a stabilization pond could almost be used as a final clarifier if it needed to be. But after that aerated lagoon, you're going to typically see just one more step to remove any last remaining solids, because the purpose with an aerated lagoon is a little bit more of that secondary treatment removal of organics, whereas a stabilization pond tends to be geared towards both. So we kind of need that settling solids removal in an aerated lagoon system that we don't typically need in a stabilization pond. So key parameters that we need to know when we're thinking about these. We need to know DO, dissolved oxygen, because again, it's the difference between aerobic and anaerobic digestion. We need to know BOD, TSS. Temperature also comes into play here. So typically ponds and lagoons you see in the southwest of the US because they have a lot of sunlight and a stable temperature year-round. If your temperature fluctuates quite a bit, sometimes ponds and lagoons are not the best choice because you do need a stable temperature in order to have the biochemical reactions that you want to have happening. So if you remember way back to the beginning of class, we talked about how kinetic reaction constants can change as a result of temperature, and they're temperature dependent. And so that's very important to remember with these types of systems. The other one is the yearly amount of sunlight exposure. So we want to use those algae in the system, and algae like sunlight. They like to be exposed to sunlight to be able to do photosynthesis. And so you need to think about how much sunlight you have potentially in the system, and direct sunlight, UV exposure. The fact that it's actually outdoors with UV light means that many times we can actually get some natural UV disinfection as well in these systems, and that's kind of a side benefit. And then we need to know our influent flow and maybe a potential need for flow attenuation. So a lot of these ponds naturally attenuate flow, so they slow it down and let water kind of settle in the system, and so we just need to be aware of that. When it comes to calculations, there's not a lot when it comes to these systems, but the biggest ones are going to be area of the pond, cross-sectional areas, and then volume of the pond. Those are really the important ones here. Other things that are going to pop up in calculations that are a little bit different for these types of systems are chemical oxygen demand, specifically from things like sulfides in particular, excuse me, because we have lots of different bacteria in the system. So we've talked about how some bacteria produce methane, Some bacteria also produce hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. And so sulfates in a system tend to have a very high chemical oxygen demand, so we need to watch that specifically in these types of systems, especially because they're a little bit more of a passive system. If we get lots of buildup of sulfides in our system, it decreases the performance over time. And then finally, we also have what's called an algal toxicity factor. So when we talked about drinking water, we said we don't want algal compounds, right? We don't want to be discharging algae to a receiving body because it's going to cause eutrophication. So we have to watch how toxic that algae potentially is, because a lot of algal compounds, a lot of algae species produce compounds that are potentially toxic to other microbes. So if your algae gets out of your control in your pond and lagoon, it can potentially be producing what we call cyanotoxins or algal toxins that can potentially kill your other good microorganisms. So many times we have to watch out for that as well. So some advantages and disadvantages of ponds and lagoons. So advantages is that it's a relatively passive treatment process. It requires very little operational influence or maintenance, and that's great, especially in a small system. It uses naturally occurring biological and chemical processes, so we really don't have to add a lot of chemicals or a lot of power, quite honestly, to these systems. And that can be a very big benefit from a cost standpoint for many systems. And it's a good way to start the nutrient removal process. Depending on the type of system you have and what types of nitrogenous or phosphoric compounds are coming into the system, this might be a good way to kind of just remove some of those nutrients from the system in a very passive way. Some disadvantages is that it requires large amounts of land. So these are big ponds and big lagoons, and so you need relatively level land, and you need probably a larger amount depending on the type of treatment that you have. So the land requirements can be something that can be a little bit of a challenge for these systems. They're difficult to operate in climates where there isn't sufficient year-round sunlight. So this is not something you'd put in the Pacific Northwest where there's lots of rain all the time. It's not a treatment system that would work really well. They can't be used in colder climates. There's nothing to say that you can't use them. There's actually some that are used in northern Canada relatively well, but the operation of those is very different. So temperature is important from the standpoint of your kinetics in your system, but sunlight exposure is also important as well for those algal species. And then maintenance can be very labor intensive. So you have to clean the whole pond and drain the whole pond. And it's a very intensive process when you have to do it. So keeping everything where it needs to be in the first place is kind of one of those things that's really important with a pond. You can kind of let it go once it starts running, but you do need to keep an eye on how much solids you're generating in the system, because cleaning out ponds is quite a labor intensive process. So last thing, some potential impacts. Generally, it's a very passive treatment process, and it mimics natural biological processes. So that generally makes it a little bit more environmentally sustainable. So sometimes this is sought after as a technology to decrease footprint, to decrease power needs, to decrease chemical addition. So it tends to be a very environmentally sustainable technology. It can also be adapted to several sizes of systems. It's actually very good for things like industrial and agricultural wastewaters. Many times those wastewaters get sent to a centralized wastewater treatment plant, and that centralized treatment plant may only really specialize in domestic wastewater. And so some of these industrial and agricultural systems might actually use stabilization ponds and lagoons prior to sending their waste to a centralized facility, because it helps to stabilize some of the compounds that are in them. So it can be used almost like a pre-treatment method for some of those systems. And then it needs to also be properly maintained to reduce the potential for odor generation. So many times when you drive past a sewage treatment plant, it doesn't smell good to start with. But ponds and lagoons can also be a source of odors, because we have gases that are being produced in the system. So we have carbon dioxide, but we also have methane gas. And methane gas has a smell to it. We can produce hydrogen sulfide gas, which has a rotten egg odor. So we do have to keep an eye on odors that are being produced in these systems. So that's a potential aesthetic impact. So that covers ponds and lagoons. In class, we're going to learn how to specifically size these units, and that's pretty much the big key component when we design these.